Byron and his inevitable entourage, which by now had reduced to his pet Greek page boy Nicolo Giro, his new Greek servants Demetrius and Sparo, not to mention his 4 Greek tortoises and 1 Greek greyhound, and the numerous trunks and bureau, beds and chaises longues, linens and library, without which no Byronic baggage train even left the station, arrived here in this bay in Malta on the 30th of April 1811, 18 months after leaving Malta on the outbound part of the Grand Tour, and already 6 months late for his lover's reunion here with Mrs. Spencer Smith. That 18 months must have seemed to Byron, by now 23, half a lifetime ago. They had taken, and helped to fill, the cargo vessel Hydra from Piraeus. But Byron and his entourage were not the only souls on board. Joining them was Niccolo's brother-in-law, the artist Gian-Battista Lucieri, who had been employed by Lord Elgin to sketch the famous columns and capitals, panels and friezes of ancient Greece. Byron had from first encounter been convinced that the Earl of Elgin was nothing more than a glorified vandal, so it is with some irony that accompanying Lucieri on the Hydra were the latest examples of the Elgin loot, the Elgin marbles, also destined for London. It was fortunate that Elgin himself was not on board, as a further cargo was to be found in one of Byron's array of portmanteaux, the manuscript of the Curse of Minerva, his savage accuse to Elgin for his pillage of Greece's monumental heritage. This unwelcome sight is the local lazaretto, or isolation hospital, and it was to here that the passengers on board the Hydra were unceremoniously parked, as indeed were all travellers from the east. A bit like an unpassported pet being decanted and offered up for quarantine on arrival at Heathrow, they could only exchange being cooped up on the Hydra for being banged up in the lazaretto. But at least it was only for 18 days, and not the 40 days isolation from which the word derived. Ah, quarantine. Every traveller's worst dread, where the perfectly healthy were imprisoned in close conditions with the perfectly unhealthy. Leprosy, the bubonic plague, fevers, deliria, pestilence of all kinds, from epidemic to pandemic. There was no end of ways to becoming unwell in the lazaretto. But in an age and place where strange and unknown diseases were random and rampant, and when the last plague here in Malta was in living memory, such precautions could not be gainsaid. Nevertheless, Byron, already feverish from an unknown Greek malady, and unsettled at being midway in his voyage from the wilful freedoms of the East to the collared conventions of the West, found the whole experience ghastly from top to bottom.
So here we are in a typical cell, one of many, all the same, going along, probably about 10 on this side, then 10 the other, another dozen or so upstairs. Presumably the bath, and these tiles are a later mod cons. This must have been a slightly better cell. What were they like inside generally?
Well, you can imagine luxury wasn't quite given much.
Byron also found the whole regime annoyingly democratic. There was one thing to have Nicolo Giro in the cell next door, whining and pouting about, but he had his 2 Greek servants, Demetrius and Sparo, over there, just slouching around, unable to wait on him. It would have driven him mad with frustration, the whole experience.
To make matters worse, Byron was unwell when he arrived, having contacted an ague, which sounds like an unreliable cousin of malaria further east. He described the ague to Hobhouse as a villainous quotidian tertian. It killed Falstaff and Mamie. It returned in quarantine in this infernal oven, and the fit comes on every other day, reducing me first to the chattering penance of Harry Gill, and then mounting me to a Vesuvian pitch of fever, lastly quitting me with sweats that render it necessary for me to have a man and horse all night to change my linen. Well, even 200 years later, it is a relief to leave the lazaretto and breathe some fresh sea air. Luckily, there is now the Royal Malta Yacht Club, just around the headland, but even after all this time, one feels a little guilty about tucking into such a good lunch here, remembering the entourage's inconveniences just around the corner. But, having survived the lazaretto, Byron's discomfort was far from over. He now had the unpleasantness of two very different goodbyes. A certain finale for his outbound amorosa Constance Spencer-Smith, and maybe, he hoped, just a coda for his inbound amoroso Niccolo Giro. Constance, who, fresh from Napoleon's grasp, had seemed to him so exotic and wilful only 18 months before, now reminded him of prim and overdressed Anglo-Saxon morality and manners that he had long since left behind and was in dread of having to face again. Byron wrote of leaving her with a diabolical explanation for their rending apart, and we can only assume he told her of his other enthusiasms. She was anyway far from unintelligent and must have expected to change Byron from the one she loved before. She was, after all, also 5 years his senior and had already experienced much of what life still had in store for the one she called her exquisite lover. But for now, she gave the history books a respite and made her way back to her older and larger husband, who was by now British ambassador to Baden-Württemberg. From now on, her fame would not come from having been Byron's lover, but from being portrayed as Fair Florence, the new Calypso, in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, a draft of which was on its way back to London with the entourage. That same foreboding about English society forewarned him that he could simply not arrive in London with the frankly outrageously camp Niccolo Giro. The decadence and debauchery of the winter in Athens would have to become their private memory, and the desperately in love and distraught Niccolo left behind with a handsome allowance to finish his schooling in a monastery in Malta. What the monks made of pretty young Niccolo we can only imagine, but Niccolo, still broken-hearted at the loss of his master and anyway not about to become a monk, simply fled back to Greece after only 4 months in a hair shirt and habit. They simply didn't suit him on any number of levels. For Byron, the first grand tour, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, was over. All that remained was the long sail back to Sheerness. Sheerness, he must have thought, tense in the stomach, is a long way from the court of Ali Pasha, the plains of Marathon, and the Maid of Athens. It's fair to say that Byron found the joys of Malta somewhat limiting, and as he left he wrote farewell to Malta. Adieu, ye joys of La Valette, adieu, Sirocco, sun and sweat, adieu, thou palace rarely entered, adieu, ye mansions where I ventured, adieu, ye cursed streets of stairs, how surely he who mounts you swears, adieu, ye merchants often failing, adieu, thou mob for ever railing, adieu, ye packets without letters, adieu, ye fools who ape your betters, adieu, thou damnest quarantine that gave me fever in the spleen, adieu, ye females fraught with graces, adieu, red coats and redder faces, adieu, the supercilious air of all who strut on militaire. I go, God knows when or why, to smoky towns and cloudy sky, to things the honest truth will say is bad, but in a different way. And now, O Malta, since thou'st got us, thou little military hothouse, I'll not offend with words uncivil, and wish thee rudely at the devil, but only share from out my casement, and ask for what is such a placement. Then in my solitary nook return to scribbling, or a book, or take my physic while I'm able, 2 spoonfuls hourly by the label, prefer my nightcap to my beaver, and bless the gods, I've got a fever.